I'm Nick Hernandez, and you're listening to the Positivity Matters podcast. We focus on the intersection of community and well being. We talk to scholars on well being, and we talk to people that are doing interesting community projects out there in the world. Today, I have the pleasure of having Dr. Ari Mountbatten-O'Malley as my guest on the program. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nick. Delighted to be with you.
I understand you are a senior lecturer in education studies at Bath Spa University, director of Flourish Cafe, uh, executive committee member of the Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain, co-lead of EduCafe, and a co-founding member and co-chair of Lovers of Wisdom Community of
Mm,
Practice Group.
mm. Yeah, that's
Are
right.
all
Yeah,
these
well,
things true? Okay.
most of them are true. I've we've just with the Philosophy of Education Society, we've just transferred to a new governance system, and so I've stepped down under the new system. So that's the only one that is it's in the process of expiring, if you like.
Okay.
But
Okay.
I've had a good run on that committee, and they're a fantastic organization. So yeah, I'm sure I'll jump back on board at some point in the future. But yeah, everything else is all there. Yeah.
So maybe tell us a little bit of the backstory about who you are. How did you get interested in well-being? And
Mm.
maybe how does some of those activities, how did you come to those things and what are they perhaps?
Okay. Well, my journey into well-being, I suppose it's, you know, not everybody is on that kind of journey, and that's one thing I've noticed. So it's not something that you can take for granted necessarily that people will be interested in well-being, happiness, flourishing, these sorts of things. Not everybody is, and in fact, there are plenty of people that are interested in the darker side of life, which I've also been interested in as well, by the way. Um, but what I mean is there's a lot of cynicism. So I think thinking in terms of well-being, happiness, flourishing, positive psycho, all these sorts of the cluster of concepts within the field of positive psychology and related fields. Not everyone is into it, so it's just worth bearing that in mind. I mean, my particular journey, I think, starts out from having a somewhat chaotic childhood, some difficult moments in my childhood, and I suppose I became just slightly interested in the human condition, the complexities
Mm,
of the human condition. Um,
yeah.
Having gone through, having experienced some really eccentric and beautifully wonderful and weird people in my life as a child, even at a very young age, and then growing up having, I suppose, some difficulties in terms of my upbringing and reflecting on the whole process of my upbringing, the whole process of the challenges I faced, of being brought up in London as a mixed race boy, and so there were, I suppose, cultural, social challenges and also family challenges, all sorts of things sort of pressing on me, if you like. So
Mm, mhm.
so it got me interested, I suppose, that the environment, I have to thank really that difficult environment for my interest in it, because I think had I have had an idyllic life, I may not have been so interested. And I don't think at the same time I would have had such a richer understanding of these sorts of issues. So I think, my understanding is developed through the difficulty, through those difficult moments in my life, and not only experiencing them, but also reflecting on them and working through them and that sort of thing. So that's really the root of it. And so I became interested in issues of psychology, philosophy, politics, and so my undergraduate degree was international politics with English, and after which was an amazing degree. I studied in the oldest Department of International Relations in the world, which, believe it or not, is in the west of Wales. Um, Fantastic department and very prestigious internationally, but in this really tiny little town in Wales, which is largely unknown. Um, so so I studied politics there, got into politics, and after graduating, I began to work in the community. So I volunteered for an organization called Citizens Advice Bureau. Now, Citizens Advice um, provide advice to members of the community for free. So you might expect normally, for example, um, if you have a debt or a housing issue, I don't know what it's like in the States. You maybe have similar systems or charity organizations, but largely you have to pay for legal advice, basically. So the Citizens Advice Service provides free advice, and they do make the distinction that it's not legal advice, but I think it's pretty close to legal advice, to be honest.
Yeah.
But there's a very robust training process that volunteers and paid workers go through before they help people. So basically, I had some excellent training with Citizens Advice Bureau, and I had exposure to what I would suggest is the dark underbelly of society. This the hidden underclass that nobody really sees. And I was really shocked and surprised by the suffering at the hands of policymakers, by the suffering of these people, by just arbitrary decisions made by either national government or local government. And, local people pushed to suicide, self-harm, and drugs misuse, drives families apart. I mean, I saw a lot of heartache and pain, to be honest. So, so I specialized. The project that I worked for at the Citizens Advice Bureau was a specialist project that was supporting members in the community that had mental health problems, and substance misuse problems. So it was really the sort of the darker end, excuse me, the darker end of the underbelly. And yeah, it was just really enlightening and educational. And I developed a passion. I already had a passion for social justice and politics. But my mind was really opened up, through my degree, through the international problems of international politics. But my eyes were really opened up about local issues through my experience with Citizens Advice as an advisor. So I was fortunate enough to be given the lead on a project. I had some great experience whilst working with Citizens Advice, developing a particular technique of um, uh, using cases to create social change. So it's a form of strategic casework that I didn't know at the time, but lawyers use. So effectively, for example, if someone is falling foul of a local or a national regulation and there's an injustice or something that's wrong within the law, you can challenge it within the law, and then it helps to create a new legal precedent, a new situation, new policy framework for others who might otherwise be negatively impacted. So I was working through that. So I developed some cool practices that were very successful. And then I was given charge of a project, um, working with agencies across the community. So all of the main agencies that were supporting those with mental health, substance misuse, alcoholism. So I got them basically all. So I did a load of data research with them, interviews. So I did triangular. So I did surveys, did interviews, and then I did an event. And all the data that came back from this project went into a published report, which was being published. It's available online. So that's my kind of entry level, if you like, into mental health and well-being, um, and my interest in supporting those with mental health and well-being issues, if you like, but not so much from a psychological perspective, from a social justice policy perspective. But then after some years doing that, despite I think what I would consider to be quite a successful run, it is quite draining. It is exhausting, and you begin to realize that actually there's something more fundamental that's going on in the policy world. That it's not really to do with um, the dealing with the policies themselves, but behind the policies there are certain ideologies and philosophical frameworks. And it's those things that are really driving the injustice in the policies. So that then was really what started me off on this road to my PhD on human flourishing.
Wow, I love. Thank you so much for sharing the backstory of that. And so then eventually you come to the point where you're doing a doctoral program where you're looking at well-being and human flourishing. And I understand you have a book coming out on the topic. So now that you're working through this rigorous academic program in the field, and publishing a book, tell us about what you've discovered in this recent work here, and a little bit about your forthcoming book.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So um, another little strand that I did mention is that whilst I was working in advice, I had begun to pick up um, and be exposed to some of the key concepts in positive psychology. So I did a short course basically in positive psychology. I did various courses. I did some courses in, for example, counseling skills. So these were just part of my, professional development, because I was dealing with, clients with under distress. A lot of the time they were vulnerable and under distress, and I wanted to make sure that I had all of the tools to my, to hand, basically, to be able to support them as best I could, and I was equipped with best practice in managing clients in distress and coaching them forward to, to a better place, really. Um, so so that was just slightly before going into the PhD. So basically, these different strands came together, So you have this kind of sensitivity to the international political realm, the sensitivity to local policies and national policies and injustices, a realization of mental health, the causes of a lot of mental health and substance misuses in the policy world, actually. So essentially, populations are often abused by their governments and are, then stigmatized for their conditions of mental health. So it's a really sort of problematic, toxic environment. But then me realizing that actually fighting a system continually isn't the only answer to resolving these things. Actually, we need to create something positive and new and fresh. And it's not always, it's not always a good use of energy fighting, Actually, sometimes what you need to do is to just create something else. And just start again, if you like, so I suppose that was all the kind of foundation going into I applied for a graduate teacher assistant graduate teaching assistant program at Edge Hill University, which is in the north of England. And basically what it is, they have some proposals for PhDs. They put out a call and then you apply, you get interviewed, and it's a highly competitive process. And if you're successful, then basically you have a funded PhD, which I did. And then they also pay for your teaching qualification in higher education. And they also provide you with experience of teaching in higher education. So it's a really well-rounded package. It's fantastic kind of what's the word? Like it's almost like a fast track into academia.
Oh,
So it was really good for me in my mature, because I mean I came into academia later in life. I didn't go um, straight from undergraduate college or university straight to postgraduate work. I didn't do that, and then into academia. I had about 10 years of practice of working in policy and research and advice, etc., campaigning. Um, so for me, it was really perfect to have kind of like that well-rounded package to bring me back in. But as I mentioned earlier, I did begin to realize that actually there's something deeper going on, and it's the deeper, more philosophical. I put forward my application for the graduate teaching assistant role, and and got the post, which was fantastic. So fully funded position with all the experience and training as well, really well supported. package they have there at Edgehill, and I'd recommend it to anyone who is able to get onto that program. It's absolutely amazing. And I started off actually with the impetus to go for an empirical piece of research that was philosophically informed. I ended up creating something completely philosophical. So it started off, yeah. So I applied for one thing, got accepted for one thing, but then I had to go through a whole process of basically changing the whole research project itself. And that was quite a challenge in its own right. It all in all, it probably delayed me a year, this change, but it was worth it because the what I discovered in the research really in my initial preliminary investigations, my literature review stage, I suppose, of the PhD was that there was a lot of confusion in the literature on what we mean by human flourishing. Lots of
Hmm.
different conceptions of flourishing, lots of different approaches to what flourishing is, how we measure it, how we can actualize it, all of these, and I found it actually to be quite chaotic and messy. Um, and so I basically put forward a proposal to change the PhD into a purely philosophical piece so that I could have the space to look into the issues, the philosophical issues of flourishing at a deeper level. Um, and that's really what the PhD is. It's a kind of deep dive into the concept of flourishing in all its kind of complex, messy glory.
So, having had all these experiences, doing all this research, tell us, what is human flourishing?
Well, it's it's a question that I try to address in the PhD, but we have to be careful. So I answer this with a degree of caution.
Yeah.
Um, because I take issue actually with the whole approach of definitions. Um, the idea of definitions is a scientific one. It's an idea that essentially comes from we transport it from the physical sciences into the social sciences. It's essentially treating something that is incredibly complex, which is language, as if it was something that was scientifically divisible and digital, actually, um, as the physical sciences are, like discrete particles or objects or whatever. But words, concepts don't operate like that. Concepts are incredibly complicated in the sense that they are contextual. So, using one word in one context can mean something else entirely in another context. Similarly, you could be using different words, but they have the same concept. They indicate or signify the same concept, but they look completely differently because they're different words being used there. So I suppose thriving, flourishing is something very, very similar, close to the same concept, pretty much. Yeah, but they're
Yeah.
different words. Whereas, a flourishing cricketer and a flourishing human being is that they're two entirely different uses there. They don't mean the same thing. A flourishing disease is not the same thing as a flourishing human either. Things like that. So so there's a lot of complexity in language, and the trouble with the approach in the social sciences, which obviously positive psychology is couched within, is that's their whole motivation. The whole motivation is to find essentially a science for the virtue ethics, which is, I think, what Seligman pronounced back in the 2001, back in those days, the early days of positive psychology, is announced essentially they were trying to find a scientific route to understanding the virtues. Now, I take issue with that approach for the reasons that I've just mentioned. So that's one thing to say. But having said that, um, once you fix a context, then you can actually fix some criteria for its meaning. It might not be a definition, which I think is probably a misleading approach, but you can come up with a criteria for what is meant in a given context. So
Hmm.
if we talk about, for example, in a general sense, if we want to be operate at the most general level, which is flourishing human beings, then there are certain things that are relevant for human beings. And this is where Aristotle actually was quite helpful in his analysis. So essentially, um, one of the things that Aristotle gave us is this form of naturalism, philosophical naturalism, if you like, where essentially what matters if we care about flourishing is we need to have a good understanding of the nature of the thing we're talking about. So in essence, he's right there, even though he took it in a slightly different direction because he valued rationality as the fundamental thing that makes people human, that makes human beings human. I disagree with that, and that was, I think the rationality is one of the criteria that was important to him in his day, if you like. That was a kind of more of a socially, culturally relative criteria rather than a general criteria for human beings. Um, but nonetheless, it is one of the important criteria for what it means to be human, to be a rational creature. That's one of the criteria. It's not the criteria, but it is one of the
Yeah.
criteria. Uh, um, so so yeah. So my point, I suppose, is that in order to understand what flourishing is for human beings at the general level, we need to respect what it means to be human. So, uh, and forgive me if this sounds, some of this can, because sometimes doing this type sort of philosophy almost sounds like you're teaching people how to suck eggs. It's like, well, obviously, we're not talking about, flourishing spanners or trees here. We're talking about humans. But it's important to make these distinctions because we very easily go awry if we don't pull back a little bit and just slow down in the analysis. Um, so if we just pull it back and just listen, what does it mean to be a human being? So I have this, if you like, this graphic that I developed for a talk at Harvard last January. Um, and so, for example, I have, like, if you like, the foundational level, what it means to be human. We're talking about moral and rational powers, and we're talking about psychological and biological processes. So essentially, those four areas are really, we can capture pretty much most of what it means to be a human being from a biological perspective, if you like, yeah? From a, like, as a species, what it is to be a human being at the species level. But then we need to think about, well, what is it to be the specific kind of human being that we are as individuals, as people? And that's where you have this importance of agency, which kind of is like the capstone over that biological category of a species, of a human species. Agency is probably the most important criteria for flourishing that I could imagine. And it's important because essentially one of the key things that we need as human beings to flourish is the ability to create. And without agency, you don't have that ability. You're essentially someone else's, surrogate slave or whatever it might be. You're
Hmm.
not an individual. So in order to flourish as a person, you need the ability to do that. And so it's a form of kind of power negotiation. This power negotiation is kind of continual, it's complex. We do it all the time. We do it with ourselves. So we do it in terms of our concept of ourselves. We have a self concept. So I suppose, self efficacy, things like that come into play in that regard. And, you know, you can have perverse, twisted, misconceived, deluded conceptions of yourself. And you could adopt those conceptions because, for example, you've had a poor upbringing as a child where you were told, you're a bad person, or you're terrible at this, or you've had bad experiences in your life where you adopt essentially labels, bad labels, negative labels onto yourself. So your self-concept is all of that. And, depending on the level of where you are with your self-concept, I mean, that's probably the first place that you should go to in terms of developing agency is figuring out your self-concept and having a good, healthy self-concept. But then there's also, because we're social political animals, as Aristotle was very keen to promote and to highlight. Because of this social political sphere, we don't live in isolated little caves. We're not, isolated creatures. We live within social networks. We're highly politicized creatures. So essentially, we have a continual power play with others, whether it be in our relationships, our social circles, or within local, national government and other kinds of fora. So all of that is a negotiation of agency as well. So essentially, if we want to know what it means to flourish, we need to understand what it is to be a human being from, if you like, a biological level, species level, and we need to understand what it is to achieve agency at the individual level, at the person level. And if we can, as an individual, if we can develop agency, then essentially what we're doing is we're working on our personal development, and we're working on moral orienteering and developing a meaningful conceptions of happiness. So this is where we truly flourish, is where we can have a sense, a good self-concept, where we have opportunities to develop as a person in all sorts of ways, educationally, spiritually, cognitively, all of those different ways. And we can develop not just happiness, not subjective well-being, not hedonic well-being. I don't mean that's minimally contributing to flourishing. What we need is meaningful happiness, which is really about orienting the moral universe, and finding ways to achieve satisfaction, contentment, peace, those sorts of things. So if we can navigate that, that's where we can find our flourishing. And often there will be moments of flourishing, not moments, that's the wrong word, because you can't but flourish for a moment. But I mean, looking at the lifespan, looking at the overall, if you like, span of someone's life, you'll have, periods of that life where you're flourishing and periods where you're languishing, suffering, or whatever. But you need both. There's no flourishing without suffering. There's no flourishing without all of that, languishing, without going through that, flourishing through fire, basically. You need that soil of difficulty in order to produce the flower of you as a person, in order to flower as a person. So it's really complex. So when you say what is flourishing, there's no easy answer. Like, you can come up with a definition. Oh, it's this. There we are. I'll get it off the shelf. Right, let's do some of that. No, it's really rich and complicated. So that's why I think it's great to see people like Paul Wong, who's, I think, he's made the positive psychology field a bit richer with his, advocacy of respecting spirituality and suffering, for example. So he's bringing in, if you like, more humanistic dimensions from humanistic psychology, bringing those sorts of the richer dimensions into positive psychology, and I think that's a step in the right direction. And I got a lot of respect for Paul Wong and the work that he's doing. But fundamentally, the field is still trapped methodologically by this drive for a science of well-being and virtue. And I think this is still hugely the fundamental problem in the field. And I've had lots of good discussions with many of the researchers and academics that I have huge respect for, but I have fundamental disagreement with, including at Harvard and other places. So I think it's going to take time for changes, but effectively my book is really about beginning to have that really deep conversation about, look, let's just really rethink what we're doing here, because it's not only an academic issue. It's not an academic issue, a purely academic issue that, oh, well, we've got these academic debates, and, Mountbatten-O'Malley says this, and, Tyler Vandervelde says this, or whoever says this, and it's these debates, Paul Wong says this. No, it's not about a kind of relativism where we can have all these different sorts of debates and they're all meaningful. No, it's really about, understanding the impact of these academic discussions because there are real world impacts on the ground. And if we don't get this right, effectively what we're doing is we're supporting deeply unethical policies and practices on the ground. So there's a kind of ethical imperative behind it, as well as an epistemological imperative to think clearer about these issues. But there's a real world impact which gives us this ethical sort of drive and dimension. I hope all of that made sense.
Oh, totally, totally. Yeah, that is great to contextualize all this and add the ethical dimension to it. That is something that I would say is, uh, a s I think maybe this is kind of, what is the saying? When the student is ready, the teacher will appear.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think you know, I have a feeling like in my own journey that this may be to help me to myself to get into the ethical social justice side of community action, perhaps. I've
Mm,
so far just been focused on like what are some things that can be done to build the upside of the human experience. So I've started a few neighborhood associations. I've
hmm
organized several monthly nights of social dancing. I've put on little community conversations where we pick some well-being topic and explore what that's like in our community. But yeah, I
mm,
haven't really made the leap yet toward uh, the alleviation of suffering, at least not intentionally. So it sounds like
mm,
this will definitely be something that helps to broaden my own uh, understanding of well-being and flourishing and how it can also connect to the alleviation of suffering. Well,
mm.
I
Yeah.
appreciate this work that you've done. I'm very looking
Mm.
forward to being able to get to digest
Yeah.
your work when that comes out.
It takes time. I mean, bear in mind, I obviously took, years sort of diving into it all. So, but you will, if you do get hold of the book, I have to say it's not cheap. It's kind of priced for university. So it's about £80. So that's probably like $95 or something. I don't know, something like that. So it's not that cheap, maybe $100 even. So it's not that cheap, but uh if you have access through a local institution, that can definitely help. And obviously, in time there'll be a paperback version, which will be a little bit cheaper as well, a lot cheaper. But
Mhm.
I think it's worth mentioning that all those things that you were doing, Nick, I mean, that's all great stuff. That's all. I mean, that's the sort of thing as well that I'm trying to do with my um, work with Flourish Cafe is to do stuff in the community that's really grounded in where the community's at, and meeting their needs. And the approach that I do with Flourish Cafe is it's not at all coming in as if I'm trying to teach them anything as an expert, and quite the opposite. I really approach my the events that I run with Flourish Cafe with an open heart and an open mind to try to understand where they're coming from in terms of what's important to them, what contributes to their flourishing. And I take it as open as that. I don't go in with any kind of like preconceived ideas of what flourishing is. It's really interesting to hear um what the outcome is of those events and the dialogue, because it can be really powerful once you know members of the community begin to feel valued, listened to, and have an avenue for expression. It's incredibly liberating. And I've had participants break down in tears. So it's been tears of joy, because of the connection that they're having with their other community members through these sorts of events. So I think, that whatever we can do in our local communities to contribute to the flourishing of our neighborhoods, it starts with the family, by the way, but branching out to, neighbors, neighborhoods, communities, whatever we can do there is important. And fundamentally, it's just about treating people with respect and giving them the dignity they deserve as human beings, and not judging them according to the kind of, this is the sort of criteria we have, I think, in the capitalist system. It's, you know, people tend to get judged according to their social and economic status. So, putting all of that aside is incredibly liberating once we just get down to earth, and begin to see the human, in everybody. It's transformational, and so, small things that can be just as powerful as, or more powerful even than, some of the sort of bigger policy, justice stuff or academic stuff or whatever that's supposedly, high impact. But really, I think that the high impact is really just from living the life out on the ground.
Hmm. Now, getting into the micro well-being, you were a good sport and you were willing to share your character strengths from the Values in Action Institute survey. And your top five strengths came out as humor, playfulness, creativity, fairness, curiosity, and appreciation of beauty and excellence. Um, what did you think of that assessment? Does it feel like some of those are about right? And how do you see some of those playing out through the work that you've been doing?
Mm. Um, yeah, uh, I do like, I'm slightly cynical of these sorts of surveys,
Sure, sure.
because they can be limiting or limited, I would say, because there's more obviously to us than these.
Yeah.
But having said that, um, I found it to be, yeah, quite good. I mean, it's limited by the fact that, you know, we answer according to our self-concept. So this is how I see myself, if you like. It doesn't mean it's true,
Right.
So, but it's how I see myself. And these surveys often will, pull that out. I mean, I do try to be honest, though. Obviously, when I do it, I try to be objective and self-critical as well, and try to be fair. So, I do try that. But I thought it was quite good. And yeah, I think it was interesting, to see beauty in there. I recently did a because I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about this apart until recently. I was invited to give a talk, earlier, actually last year. I was invited to give a talk, at an international conference in the States at the university, the Catholic, University of America, and
Hmm.
um, and it was on, a project oriented around beauty and well-being, and it was really interesting. I explored, so I have an interest in the concept of wonder, so that relates to that curiosity criteria that, came up in the survey. So anyway, so I have an interest in the concept of wonder, and so I related wonder, flourishing, and beauty in my talk. And it's not something that I give a lot of time to, beauty, but then going through the going through the process of preparing for that talk, and also I did a Flourish Cafe on beauty and flourishing, and science, actually, afterwards with the same organizers. Um, as I um, as I sort of worked through these sorts of things, I realized that actually I was a lot more sensitive to the aesthetics, of my experience, if you like, than I had realized. And for example, where I live, I mean, it's in a beautiful city. Um, I love to. I'm very blessed. I have lovely views that looks over the valley of, the Avon Valley of Bath, so I can see the city of Bath just ahead of me there all the time when I'm working.
Hmm.
Things like that. And it's amazing how actually. the simple things, well, I mean, we could call it nature, or we could call it the appreciation of the beauty of nature. It's, and looking at the stars and things like that, just having my little micro moments, or sitting at the beach and enjoying when I get to visit. I mean, I used to live by the beach, but whenever I get to visit now, because I don't live there anymore, but these sorts of moments actually are really powerful, and they can be some of the best, most memorable moments of our lives. So I suppose when that came back, it just reminded me a little bit that, yeah, I suppose, yeah, I never really
Hmm.
thought about it, but much, but actually these are really these the aesthetics of living is really important to me. I like, to sense beauty and wonder around me all the time. And I try to create spaces of beauty and wonder as well. So yeah, it's that was kind of um almost like revelatory, in terms of, yeah, my own sort of understanding of myself. But yeah, everything else was kind of like what I expected, to be honest. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, we share a couple. I've gotten the humor playfulness one pretty much every time that I've taken it. Curiosity, that's been on there every time. And
Mm,
appreciation of beauty and excellence, that one's always been on there too. I guess the idea behind some of these is that we almost have a drive to manifest some of these traits, and in so doing, that it gives us like uh, a deep sense of satisfaction. I guess that's the intent of the survey, is to help us identify those traits that bring us the most satisfaction.
sure.
So it's kind of like, I almost see it as like one potential piece in, like, if we were to try to formulate some kind of an individual prescription for flourishing for the individual, it'd be like maybe something like, you know, to most rapidly elevate your life satisfaction, or something like really connect with your strengths and figure out ways to engage them. And
Mm,
in that construction of bringing something new into the world, let that be informed by your strengths, perhaps. In the interaction amongst one another, it's like each of these strengths finders only captures so much of human potentiality and leaves so much off the table
yeah,
also. But it's like,
inevitably.
for that part that they are trying to capture, um this is very like theoretical and conceptual, and I don't know if there's any actual research on it. But my thought is like to have that awareness of strengths, and then my hunch is that people will probably have some affinity to a bond with each other if they have at least a few strengths in common. Um,
Mm, mm,
and then maybe if some of their other top strengths are maybe lower or way lower in the other person's strengths, that maybe they have the potential to cultivate those traits, but they
mm,
don't have like as they don't get as much satisfaction out of cultivating those lower traits as they do their higher traits. But if you're
mm,
around someone else that has that trait and it's one of their top ones,
mm,
and they're like, sort of driven to express it, and they're excited about it, it's like maybe
mm,
that creates sort of a catalytic force in our own potential to cultivate that strength.
mm.
That's very theoretical. So again,
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean,
yeah,
there is that, there is the opposites attracts and things like that. So I think where we have a weakness in one area, um, sometimes it can pull us towards others that have that area as a strength. Um, and because we can learn a lot from them. But then obviously equally, where we have similar strengths as someone else, then we can have a lot of synergy with those people. So yeah, I think these surveys are good as a kind of, just as you're using it now, as a kind of like prompt and a starting point for further
yeah,
inquiry and discussion. They're not the end, they're not the kind of, it doesn't, lead you to anywhere, to any depth, but it leads you, it's a good prompt, and it's a good, and that I think if we accept its limitations, they're great. There's nothing wrong with them, they're good. The trouble is, for me, is where some of these sorts of self-report surveys are used, to formulate policies, to inform, significant, yeah, policy frameworks or whatever it might be, then, or assumptions about human nature or human well-being, etc. Then, research sort of paradigms, etc. Well, that's where I think there's overstretching, and a lack of recognition of the limitation of this sort of approach. Um, but yeah, I mean, so but so as we understand its limitations, it's perfectly good, and I think that's a wonderful thing in the positive psychology movement, is it's given us an array of these kinds of tools, that can begin to start the conversation on, strengths and virtues, and, rather than, because that was the whole point, wasn't it, of positive psychology as well. It wasn't just a methodological looking for the science of, well-being, and virtue, but also it's in response to, the sort of traditional pathological approach to mental health, which is interested only in dealing with problems. So
Yeah.
the whole idea is to contrast with that, and to say, well, look, we don't only have to look at problems. There are actually, strengths that we can focus on, and etc. And so it's a really welcome move, I think, from my perspective. Um, in a in the field of human knowledge, it's really valuable. It's got, I've learnt loads from, doing some of these surveys and thinking about it and going through that self-reflective process. um uh and it's been very exciting. Some of them are really, enlightening. I can't remember. There's a cool little book, by, Ilona Bonniwell, Positive Psychology in a Nutshell. It's
Hmm.
one of the first positive psychology books I read. Um, and it's just packed with little kind of those sorts of tools. I don't know, there's a life cycle one, there's a time conception one. I don't know. There's all sorts of ones. There's like loads in there. But I found I had such fun going through all those different exercises. Um, so yeah. Emotional intelligence. So yeah, all sorts of stuff. So it's a good fit. I think we're very lucky to get to be part of this field. And I'm very grateful to have, opportunity to dive into these sorts of, deep topics, to be honest, to do with the human condition.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like you're doing a lot with it. And you mentioned Flourish Cafe. Maybe is this something that has the potential to spring up anywhere, or is it what? Tell us a little bit more about it. What does it look like in action?
Mm,
If you want to flourish cafe in your community, what needs to happen?
yeah, yeah. So, firstly, I have to just add a caveat that it's not quite where I want it to be at the moment. I want it to be ready to be rolled out internationally, but it's not quite ready yet. But anyway, so let me just give you a picture. So essentially, I don't know if you're, familiar with World Cafe as a method. Have you
I haven't
experienced
heard.
it?
No, I have
No,
not.
okay. So World Cafe is, I mean, it started off in California, I think, in the 90s, and started off in the corporate world, actually. So essentially, it's a form of dialogue with, but using, um, visuals, using doodling and brainstorming, mind mapping techniques, and using visual metaphor. Um, so it's a form of, um, it's a form of garnering collective intelligence, basically. Um, so the point of it is, So the traditional meeting, for example, you have someone up front, lecture style. Yeah, they go through the agenda. Um, it's a very controlled environment, and everything is time limited. It's and it's very strict and formalized. So these sorts of meetings are very open and creative. Essentially, it's about talking about what's meaningful to the participants. So rather than the agenda being led by a chair or someone who's leading the event, they might help to create and be a catalyst and for the event, and they might coordinate the event, etc. But it needs to be informed by the participants in the room. So essentially, it's very democratic. Um, in its kind of value system that's underpinning it. It's creative. It encourages divergent thinking. So not just thinking with the mind and the rational faculties, but thinking emotionally, thinking visually, thinking in alternative ways. And so just to help to make it a little bit more sort of concrete, uh, what we tend to do. So in terms of Flourish Cafe, what I do is I work with a partner who's embedded in the local community. Um, and that's vital because they know their community. And essentially, we try to work together in co-design. So the partner will have their network and contacts within the community, and we'll try to work with them to create an event for the local community that is oriented around flourishing. So essentially, what we have is an event with food, drink, music in the background, a relaxed environment where we just talk about flourishing. Yeah. Um, but we talk about flourishing in um, a specific context. So it might be, for example, it might be concerns around the environment, or it might be concerns around social justice. It might be concerns around the meaning of education, whatever. So just depends on what's of particular interest in that community, but it's oriented, the Flourish Cafe is always oriented around flourishing. So the beginning, if you like, so usually work through three questions, sometimes four if we have time. Um, the first one is almost always going to be an exploration of what flourishing is for that community in round. So they talk about it, they draw about it, they mind map it, and they move around between different tables talking about it. So essentially, what you have is by the time we've gone through, say, at least three questions, you have each table with a tablecloth on there that has had three different groups on it with three different sets of conversations, three different sets of mind maps and connections and drawings and visuals, etc. So you have a very sort of complex interweaving of knowledge between all the different participants. Um, and so it's really, really actually rewarding, the experience of it. It's very relaxing, it's very creative. There's a lot of agency for participants, and there's a lot of connection that's been built. So there's a lot of listening. People listen to each other, and then they automatically settle into different roles. So some are more active with the drawing and the listening. Some are more active in terms of speaking, etc. And they sort of ebb and flow between each other seamlessly. So it's a really lovely environment. And by the end of the event, firstly I open the event, obviously then we go through the rounds. Then I end the event with a harvest phase, which is basically trying to garner the key insights, the collective intelligence from the room, through the process of those three different rounds of conversations, moving within different groups, having these different conversations on these different questions. What are the things that really helped to emerge and what stood out for them? What are they going to take with them? And that's really the most important part of the event, is this sort of harvest phase, really, where they can actually think about what was most important and how they can begin to apply it in their context, in their lives, and what they're going to do to take things forward. So, in a nutshell, that's it. But what sits behind it is this theory, that's informed by David Isaacs and people like that, Juanita Brown, some of the pioneers in World Cafe as a method. It's informed by the philosophy and theories of their manuals on World Cafe, and it's also informed by flow research in flow. By people like Csikszentmihalyi, and others who are interested in flow technology, really sort of helping to create spaces where people have this connection and are able to be immersed in the moment, in the present, really. And all oriented towards flourishing. So does that make sense? I don't know if it does, but
Yeah. Yeah, no, that sounds wonderful. That sounds really wonderful.
yeah.
So you're planning on rolling it out internationally. That is exciting.
Yeah. So I mean, I have a lot of interest, for working in the States. So we just figuring out how to do it at the moment. Because my vision for Flourish Cafe, because it's reliant on me at the moment. Um, and I work full time as an academic. I also sit on all these different committees, so my time is kind of and I'm a family man, so time is really, really tight. So
Yeah.
what I do is I take, holiday days in order to deliver events, basically. Yeah. So that's how I'm managing it at the moment, but that's not sustainable. What my vision for Flourish Cafe is to have some kind of, I suppose, training program, something like where I can equip community champions, and then they can deliver their own Flourish cafes in their communities under the banner of Flourish Cafe. Um, and then they can even, maybe begin to train others as well. So train the trainer, that sort of thing. So then it will really take off. So that's where I'm at, and I'm hoping to begin to develop this training program this summer, all being well. So yeah, but I wanted to give myself some distance, and some time to really think and stew about what kind of structure do I want for Flourish Cafe. Because initially I thought about, a co-op, for example, which is that community-owned organization, that sort of thing. Um, and I've got colleagues, I've got like Dr. Simon Duffy, who heads up, for example, the director of the Citizen Network, which is a global network of, it's a co-op itself, but it's a global network of citizen-based organizations, and it's a fantastic. He's amazing, a visionary for a star. But I've got a model that I can begin to work with if I wanted to go down that route. But I know it's an awful lot of work, and I would struggle to do it at as well on top of all my other things. So I
Yeah.
think I think probably the best way that's realistic at the moment is this, train the community champions approach, and then maybe in time I could begin to roll back some of my other academic work and do some of this stuff more full time. That would be really, really good, because it's really important and powerful work, to be honest, and I get a lot of satisfaction from it.
All right. Well, now you've got that on the ground program, you got your academic work happening, and maybe at the academic and conceptual level, or at the on the ground level, you kind of laid out what kind of plan for the future you have. How about on the intellectual side? You mentioned that connectedness between how those ideologies sort of have an effect behind the scenes in public policy. Um, do you have hope that this flourishing research can maybe have some kind of an effect through public policy, and elevating the state of well-being in the world? Is it is that probably not going to be the avenue for that to happen? Or and then just more generally, like, what's your vision for the future for where
Mm.
your research is going?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually, Nick. And I have been thinking about it for some time. I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer, because in many ways the future is incredibly unknown and unstable at the moment. We have so many different crises kind of happening on multiple levels, that it's very uncertain, the future. And so uh, I think my hopes for the impact of my work really are in democratizing flourishing, the concept of flourishing, so bringing it down to earth a bit. My work, the book that's being released in May is about really it's about understanding the complexity of terms like flourishing, and it is but the effect of that is to almost disempower the uh, current chiefs, if you like, of flourishing and well-being and happiness, because there is a power structure internationally that has, grown from, I think, some problematic philosophical foundations, certainly methodological foundations. So my hope, if you like, on the academic side is that the concept is democratized and that more researchers are going to engage with flourishing on a more humanistic level, respecting its complexity and the importance of context. So that's the first thing, and I think that's a kind of ethical drive that I have there. In terms of policy and those other realms, if you like, because that's also of interest to me. I'm interested really in similarly democratizing politics. So the work that I'm doing with Flourish Cafe in a way is a form of re-democratization within communities. Communities have for many decades been disempowered, and have effectively lost their agency. They've lost their way of navigating the complex issues in life. Once we give spaces to reflect on flourishing from a ground up perspective, a grassroots perspective, I believe and I think it's really transformational. And I think people begin to realize what is valuable in life, actually, what is more important than the kinds of things that are sold to them, whether it be through television, films, or politics, or even friends and, social networks. So I, I think it's potentially quite personally transformational, these explorations and forays into flourishing. So I hope to have a small impact, at least, a little part to play in um I don't know, in bringing to life local democracy, local communities, local people, local values, local agency, local, taking charge of your life really as a member of your community, taking responsibility and being active, an active citizen, taking your responsibilities as a voter or your responsibilities as a citizen or a member of the community seriously. All of that, I think, I hope to contribute towards through my work in, with Flourish Cafe in particular. So I've got those kind of two strands really. One is dealing with elites, and the other is dealing, is supporting, I would say, local communities to have space to consider the important things in life. And then my two kind of strands that, are important to me, I suppose, at the moment. And, I hope my work has some impact in those areas. You can only do what you can do. You can only try according to the best of your knowledge and ability. That's all you can do, isn't it? So that's what I'm trying to do. And like I said, I hope there's some positive impact.
Awesome. It sounds like you're on an agency building path for yourself that's helping to build opportunities for agency building for others.
Mm,
I love it.
nicely put. Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
Dr. Airy, thank you so much for being a guest on the Positivity Matters podcast, and I hope that this has a little positive effect on the world of well-being, and maybe that it comes around again someday to hear what's happened with these dual threads of work that you do. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. It's been a real pleasure.